Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at how to use cell arrays in a very specific example that focuses on growing a cell array based on the contents or iterations of a for loop. The idea here is with a cell array that you can store multiple different data types in the same array, but ultimately, we don't know how many rows we will need. The idea is that maybe we want to store the results of a successful ping along with the IP address, maybe a logical value, maybe a numeric value, etc. And we want to be able to grow this array based on the number of IP addresses we wish to scan or ping. And so to start off with, I'm going to set up the problem. We're going to be looking, for instance, at IP addresses that match the pattern of 192.168.0 all the way up to 192.168.1.255. Now, by itself, that doesn't seem that hard. In other words, basically, you have 256 values. You could technically go ahead and allocate the cell array at the beginning. In other words, if you wanted to have 3 or 4 columns, you would simply use the function that allows for you to create a cell array or cell. And you can simply specify then the size of the cell array in the constructor. So you could see here that you can actually specify the size of a cell array. Well, again, that's if you know the size up front. And we can simply make this a little bit more challenging by looking at 2 subnets. So let's say, for instance, that we also want to scan the 2.x network. In other words, we want to go from 2.0 up to 2.55. Now, you could probably argue, well, that's fine. That's just simply a multiple of 256. Well, maybe we don't want to scan then the entire network, so we want to stop again at some other value. Well, the problem is that we can't necessarily determine how many cells we need up front, and this is where this little trick comes into play. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a nested for loop that allows for me to loop through both subnets. Now notice effectively what I'm doing is I'm simply changing the values for the 3rd and 4th octet. We're going to start off with 1 and go to 2. And then for the 4th octet, I'm going from 0 to 255. And so right off the bat, you should recognize this then as a nested loop. And so I'm going to start with the outer loop being the octet 3, and it is going to range in values from 1 to 2. Now I'm going to use the longhand notation for the for loop. You can also get away with the shorthand notation, and then optionally you can also get away without these square brackets. But again, for clarity's sake, I like to use the square brackets. And we're going to do the same thing now for the 4th octet, and then we're going to go from 0 up to 255. And again, depending on what you're trying to do, this is probably more IP addresses than you ultimately wish to scan. Now, what we can do is we can create then a variable called ipv4 that's just simply going to capture then the IP address for a specific iteration. And we can do this a number of different ways. We can use our sprintf function, and then we can go ahead and hard code in the first 2 portions of the IP address, and then follow that up with either a %d or a %s, depending on how you've set this up. In this case, I'm going to use %ds because I do know that they are integers. And then for that first %d, then I'm just simply going to drop in the value for octet 3, as well as for octet 4. Now, The idea here is we can simply loop through, and as a matter of fact, we're just going to go ahead and display our ipv4 just so you get a good idea of what in the world is actually going on here before we go any further. And you'll see that I have a whole bunch of IP addresses flashing by in the command window. And if you scroll through it, you'll see that you have both the 1.x as well as the 2.x networks covered. Now, that's fine. We could go a step further and possibly go ahead and create a command using the exact same principle. In other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to again use my sprintf, and maybe what I want to do is a ping -n to indicate that I want to ping exactly once, and I want to ping that particular IP address. And in this case, I'm going to use %s, and I'm just simply going to put in that ipv4 address that I built earlier. Now, again, we can leave the display in, we can display the command. That's not really the purpose of this video. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you in another video how you can actually use then the system command to run the ping command. But again, that's outside of the scope of this particular video. Instead, what I want to do is I simply want to capture the results or report, whatever you would like to call it, in a cell array. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by creating a 0x0 cell array. And why is it a 0x0? Well, it turns out that if you use the empty curly braces, it's essentially the equivalent of running that cell constructor with a 0x0 input, 0, 0 input. Now, what we want to do is every time we loop through this inner for loop, we simply want to update our results cell array. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to figure out exactly how many rows are currently in our results. And we can do this by simply saying results count. And I tell you what, for consistency's sake, we'll leave it like that. Yes, results count, the size of results, and we want to specify the first dimension, which is the number of rows in the results array, or rather the current number of rows in the results array. And the idea then is we can use this results count, because it'll ultimately change each iteration, to be able to add one more row in our results cell array. So how do we do this? Well, we again access the cell array. This time, though, we use the curly braces to indicate that we want to access a particular row. And for the row number, instead of hard coding a row number in, what we will do is we will simply use results count +1. And then for the column, we can hard code then the column. And in this particular case, what I'd like to do is I'd like to simply store then whatever ipv4 address was produced by this nested for loop. Now, before we go any further, let's think about this. Initially, the results cell array is a 0x0 cell. In other words, it has 0 rows. And so for the first iteration of this inner for loop, our size of results comma 1 will be 0, and 0 + 1 is 1, which simply indicates that we are trying to access row 1. The second iteration of this inner for loop, we will again calculate results count, but this time around, it will be 1. In other words, there'll be 1 row, and we simply add 1, or 1 + 1 is 2, to access the second row. Now, hopefully you find this trick kind of neat. What we can do now is we can simply repeat this multiple times, just changing the column number. And maybe, for instance, you wish to capture the command as well. And I'm just going to create a couple placeholders here, particularly for the third column. And I'm just going to simply create an empty set of our empty character vector by using an empty set of quotes. And then at this point, I think you could probably figure out the pattern. We could also do something like for the fourth column, we could use a function like date string combined with now. And so we'll look at this real quick in the command window. So we have our date string now. And you can see that we would get the current time. So if we, for instance, needed to have a timestamp, you'll see that there is actually a couple of ways to do this in Matlab. I'm leaving this warning up here because you could see that there is also the date time functionality. Again, we've got a couple of different options here. And at this point, then let's go ahead and run all of this. So I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and clear my workspace. I'm going to go ahead and save my script. I'm just going to run the whole thing, and you can see there's a whole lot of noise going by on the command window, arguably way too much. We probably should sneak in a couple of curly braces, a couple of semicolons here. So let's take a second to go ahead and put a semicolon on each of these lines. Likewise, we can arguably leave the display in or not. Let's clear our workspace one more time. We'll go ahead and run this, and you can see that I have all of my IP addresses down in the command window, but we now have a 512 by 4 cell array. And in each one of the rows is the IP address, the command that I created, as well as a timestamp. Now, hopefully you can combine this with some of my other videos and get a working IP address scanner for a subnet. Now, the only thing I want to point out is before you try to run this, especially if you're using the system command that I show you how to do in other videos, make sure that you're on a private network. We definitely do not want to do this on a public network. And as always, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.